will, any questions? We'll continue on to the motor systems. So again, no chapter in the book that we're using. I did scan a copy of a chapter from this book, which is his other book, which is frankly almost exactly the same as your book, except it has a chapter on this topic and yours doesn't. And so I added a motor systems chapter that's available online. It is optional reading. I will make sure that the material, the questions on the exam are answerable from this lecture. But if you feel like you're having trouble understanding the material and you want a second resource, your go-to resource is that chapter from this book. The book is here. If you want to look at it during a break, you're welcome to. If you want to get it from the library, if you want a better quality look at it, that's another option for you. But so that is where this material was developed from, and so if you want help understanding it, that's a good resource. Okay, so the reason I added this in is I do feel it would be kind of remiss to have a course on physiology of behavior, physiological psychology, and not talk about motor control, because it is a fairly important skill that humans have. And so I want to do that, and so I'm going to add this lecture in. So the motor control is the function of the frontal lobe primarily in the cortex. And you can loosely divide the cortex into sensory and motor components. And sensory in a loose sense is conceptually the same as efferent. Efferent means information coming in from the body, information coming in from the environment. And motor is the afferent. Afferent means the information going out. And so you have a sensory system and you have a motor system, and in a really broad sense you can, sorry, hold on a second. In a really broad sense, you can think about brain control as being sensory and motor in a broad sort of sense. So in that broad sort of sense, you can think about control of body organs as being a motor function, like sympathetic activation and things like that, in a very broad kind of sense. And senses don't only mean senses from the environment, they also mean senses from the body, like the kinesthetic and proprioceptive senses that we talked about last week. So the occipital, temporal, and parietal lobes are all primarily sensory lobes, but the frontal lobe is primarily a motor output lobe. And motor output in a broad sense includes not only actual control of muscles, like controlling your fingers, your trunk muscles, and so on, but also planning complex responses. And that's a really important concept. So humans are not particularly more coordinated than other organisms in a broad sense. I mean, there's a lot of fine motor coordination that other primates have. What humans do better than any other organism is plan complex responses, meaning we're highly able to evaluate a situation and choose subtly differentiated response options that are appropriate to the situation. Whether that means that you talk to your mother in a different way than you talk to your friends, it could mean that you dress in a different way for work than you dress for a soccer game. It could mean that you respond to a bee biting you differently than you respond to a dog biting you. And so in a wide variety of respects, specialization of motor output to the situation is really something that humans do very well. And that encompasses our talking, our acting, a wide variety of behaviors that we engage in. So to credit like the biobehavioral kind of concept, which is a little bit different from a biopsychosocial model of psychology, it's important to note that higher order cognition is very important. It is very hard to explain human behavior without it, but ultimately the purpose of higher order cognition is to serve the purpose of allowing for more specific motor responses. Meaning all the thinking that you do is really justified or validated by how it changes the behavior that you engage in. Even if that behavior is a behavior that is as cognitive as saying or writing down what you're thinking, that's still a behavior. And so the role of cognition is to modulate behavior. And that takes many forms. Things like indirect pursuit of a goal, right? So that could be like tacking against the wind in a sailboat. It could be like going around a table rather than trying to walk through it. Inhibition of less useful responses. So that could be things like you want to cross the street, and so you would start walking across the street, but there are cars coming and it's a red light, and so you stop and you don't walk until there's a green light. So you want to inhibit the less useful response, like walking into a crowded street that would get you killed. Multi-step planning, that could be very simple, like you may have a door that has a couple locks and you have to open the locks in the correct sequence and with the right keys. It might be something as complicated as planning a dissertation or a project at your company or something like that. And then diversified responses that are optimized to context. Again, things like talking to your mother differently than you talk to your friends, or responding to an email from a coworker differently than you respond to spam, or if you're asked to solve a problem at work, you might solve that problem constructively. You might have a different kind of response at home, but the response that you engage in the community might get you fired at work, so you don't want to do that there. So diversified responses. These diversified responses could also be understood in the evolutionary context, right? Like if you're going to hunt elephants, you want to hunt them differently than you hunt deer, because the elephant's more likely to try to kill you. And so you want to be able to diversify your responses. Basically, for instance, that the sympathetic response is to fight or flee. You want to pick the right of those two options, or even modulate how you choose those options. Like if you're fleeing from a tank because you're in a war zone, fighting the tank with a stick is probably not going to be very useful. You need to decide if you have a weapon that's adequate to the role of fighting a tank, right? So, in that sense, cognition ultimately serves its purpose of refining behavior and modulating behavior. So, behavior occurs through muscles, right? And briefly, there are three important classes of muscles: skeletal, smooth, and cardiac muscles. And we're going to really focus on skeletal muscles today. But just briefly, skeletal muscles are muscles that handle body motions. And so these are the main striated muscles: your biceps, your triceps, your gastrocnemius, all these things you're used to. Smooth muscles are involuntary muscles that do a variety of things, such as constrict or expand blood vessels, support basic body functions like digestion and respiration. These are involuntary muscles, meaning you don't directly consciously control these, although conscious actions can have indirect effects on smooth muscles. For instance, behavioral exercises like relaxation can result in vasodilation, opening blood vessels. So there is some indirect conscious control of involuntary muscles, but that's not primarily how they're controlled. And then finally, cardiac muscles, also involuntary. Sorry, it's got cut off. They control the heart, as you might expect, and blood flow. So different kinds of muscles, and these muscles are histologically different, or they have different cellular structures. But we're going to focus really on this one because it's a good tool to understand how the motor system works. Most of the motor system is organized around controlling skeletal muscles. And if you think about that, that's kind of consistent with our development. If you think about what you do, your heart doesn't do something that's really very different than what a dog or a cat's heart does. But your hands do something very, very different than what a dog or a cat's paws do. And so there's a lot of refinement of what our skeletal muscles do. There's relatively little refinement of what these other muscles do. So the skeletal muscles. Skeletal muscles are called skeletal muscles because they're anchored to bones. They're anchored to bones via tendons, but there are some exceptions. So there are some systems where they're one-sided bone anchoring, and those would be things like abdominal muscles and the skeletal muscles of the eye. And so, for instance, they're like the eye muscles are rooted on bone on one side, but then they attach the eye on the other side to turn the eye. So generally speaking, outside of some of these exceptions, muscles work to manipulate joints in bones. And so the contraction of a muscle causes the joint to extend or flex. And the book talks about that synaptic difference. So muscles are contractile tissue. That's all they do is shorten and then go back to their original length. It's the limbs that extend or flex. So for instance here, as I move my arm, this is flexing and this is extensing of the arm, right? So if you're familiar with arm muscles, for instance, there are muscles that are contracting for both of these. So for instance, the bicep is a muscle that contracts during flexion, but the tricep is a muscle that contracts during extension. I think if I have that right. So the muscle is always contracting, but the joint is extending or flexing, or it's an extensor or flexor response. The muscle fibers consist of myofibrils, and these are made of overlapping protein structures, actin and myosin strands. And it's this overlapping structure between these two strands that allows a muscle to contract. I'll show you a picture of how that works in a moment. But I will mention before that skeletal muscles actually come in two different kinds of fiber varieties. There's an extrafusal or alpha motor system, and there's an intrafusal or gamma motor system. So the extrafusal system is the system that is outside of the center spindle of the muscle. So the bicep, if you look at a bicep, in the center of it there's a intrafusal component, that's the spindle, and then surrounding that is extrafusal muscle fibers, all the exterior fibers. And the muscle fibers of the extrafusal system are constructed of one alpha neuron with many muscle fibers. And that one-to-many relationship together is called a motor unit, and there could be one or many motor units involved in a motor response. And the intrafusal spot, the muscles work in a slightly different fashion. Here's a picture of some of that. So first of all, I'll mention that you'll hear a skeletal muscle called striated muscle. It's striated because of these structures in the muscles that have to do with these myosin and actin bands. And so these bands that cause the muscle to contract are what makes it look striated. But here's the muscle fiber. Again, it connects to bones by tendons. Again, it's manipulating a joint, right? And so as this muscle contracts, it pulls this bone up. That's flexing this joint. And as this muscle relaxes, then this joint extends again. The external fibers are the alpha motor neuron system. The internal spindle fibers are the gamma motor neuron system. And here's a picture of that showing a cross section. Inside here, these are intrafusal or spindle or gamma systems. And these are extrafusal or outside of the spindle or alpha. And what's important to know is, in particular, that there are sensory endings. The sensory endings project into the intrafusal muscle fiber, and this is a self-regulatory system. And we'll talk about that in a second. And that self-regulatory system is the gamma motor neuron system, whereas the alpha motor neuron system is primarily involved in the actual muscle action that's desired. So the extrafusal system is the one that really is responsible for muscle contraction. And some things to know about this. The neuromuscular junction is a special kind of synapse. It works differently than other synapses in other parts of the body. The terminal button releases acetylcholine, and this again goes back to those questions that we just discussed. So acetylcholine is directly an excitatory neurotransmitter at the neuromuscular junction, as opposed to in the brain, it functions as a neuromodulator. But out here in the muscles, it acts as an excitatory transmitter. And it produces a special kind of output. The excitatory input coming from acetylcholine to the muscle creates something called an end plate potential. And the difference between end plate potential and a normal response, like an excitatory postsynaptic potential, is that in a neuron, each incident excitatory synapse causes an EPSP, right? So the downstream neuron accepts the neurotransmitter. There's an excitatory postsynaptic potential, which lowers the threshold. Those postsynaptic potentials are summed together, and when there's a sufficient number of them to lower the potential, the neuron fires, right? This system works differently. Every time acetylcholine is released at the terminal button, the muscle fiber fires. So it always fires. It's not a summing of potentials. And firing of the muscle fiber causes calcium channels to open. And the influx of calcium allows energy extraction from adenine triphosphate. And essentially what happens is that actin bridges pull themselves across the myosin, And as they pull themselves across the myosin, kind of like someone climbing up a knotted rope, they pull the myosin together. That causes the muscle fiber to contract or twitch, and the muscle then relaxes slowly as the calcium exits through other channels. So, one important concept here, we talked about the all or nothing concept, which was that neurons either fire or don't fire, right? They don't fire a little bit for small EPSPs and a lot for big ones. They sum up to their depolarization potential and then they fire, their action potential. Here, in the motor system, what happens is that every firing of the acetylcholine neuron leads to a firing of the muscle fiber, the motor unit. So, first of all, overlapping end plate potentials cause sustained contraction. So, these actin fibers row their way across the myosin, they pull the myosin together, that contracts the fiber, and then they slowly let go. If another end plate potential happens, then they contract again. So the muscle might start out like this, it rows in, and then it rows out, and say there are lots of end plate potentials. If that's the case, then right away, it gets rowed back in, and it rows out a little bit, and it gets rowed back in. So basically the muscle stays fairly contracted. And that makes sense, right? If you think about your muscles, like if you make a muscle, you make a muscle builder pose or something, those muscles stay fired, right? It's not like my hand flings back out. My bicep remains contracted, and I can keep my bicep contracted for quite a while. So the system has to work in such a way that these fibers can remain contracted. Because here you're talking about an actual muscle fiber, like a big muscle fiber that extends from here to here. So it has to be contracted in order for my arm to be in this position. It can't be extended in the bicep. And so it has to be able to remain contracted. And it's actually the number of motor neuron units the number of these alpha motor neuron units that fire that determines the strength of the motor response. Because each one of these controls several muscle fibers. If they're all firing, then all the muscle fibers are strongly contracting. They're not getting pulled along for the ride. And I'm generating a very strong response from that muscle. If just some of them are firing, those ones are pulling themselves together and they're contracting. And I already told you that they either have to contract or not contract. So what's happening is they're not only doing the work of moving my arm in any weight that I'm holding, they're also contracting the rest of the muscle fibers, so that's a weak response. Whereas if all the muscle fibers are actively contracting, that's a strong response. Does that make sense? Yeah. So that's the extrafusal system. Fusel or spindle outside of the spindle. And that's the way that your body uses muscles to actually do work. The spindle system is on the inside. This is kind of the management department. The spindle system and the intrafusal or inside the spindle fibers, they run parallel to the extrafusal fibers. Again, you can see that here in this picture, right? Along this muscle, the intrafusal fibers run along the muscle, the extrafusal fibers run along the muscle. They're all running along the muscle. So they're parallel. They contain sensory nerve endings that detect stretch and serve as detectors of muscle length. And there are actually two kinds of these receptors. One that responds to small forces to maintain muscle tone, and a second one that responds to big forces or rapid changes in muscle length. There's also another organ called the Golgi tendon organ, which detects stretch, but it does something slightly different. The Golgi organ it detects stretch that is pooled across the fibers. Because of the tendon, all the fibers are coming together. And so the Golgi tendon, in essence, the Golgi tendon organ detects the overall force of the stretch, or how hard the muscle is pulling. And this acts as a feed-forward system, meaning as the muscle is stretching, the Golgi system fires, and as the Golgi system is firing in advance of the muscle contracting strongly. So one function of this is to protect from injury. And so for instance, if a muscle is pulling very hard, it could pull free from the tendon. You don't want that, right? And so this feed-forward system has to be fast enough to prevent that. And there's an effect called the clasp knife effect. And so for instance, in a person who has a flexure posture, like this is a flexure posture of the upper arm, say they're unconscious or something, as you're pulling this, there'll be a point where if you pull hard enough, the arm will give way. sort of like if you have a knife that folds in half, like a hunting knife. You think about it, you're pulling and it's got resistance, then it pops open. The same thing happens to that muscle. That's the Golgi tendon organ in action. As I'm pulling hard enough, the stress on the muscle is high enough that there's a risk of injury, and then the clasp knife effect kicks in and the muscle releases. That can be inhibited, so that's the reason I'm talking about this in a person who's not consciously capable of inhibiting that response. So that's the Golgi tendon organ system. In the spindle system, the role is to detect tone and maintain adequate response strength. Whereas in this system, one mechanism is this feed-forward mechanism which prevents injury. So here are some pictures to graphically show you how some of that works. So here in this first example, these are the two kinds of spindle senses, and then this one is the Golgi tendon organ. So here, if you passively lower your arm with gravity, the low strength one is firing. This is the one that responds to small forces. And so it's maintaining muscle tone as you lower your arm, rather than letting your arm just flop down. If you rapidly lower your arm, you also get fire from spindle system 2, because in that initial jerk, you have high muscle fiber forces. You're not stressing out the Golgi tendon organ system though, because this system responds to the weight that's received. And so in contrast here, when there's an actual weight put on the hand, the Golgi tendon system starts firing in a feed-forward fashion to monitor whether this weight is excessive and is in danger of injuring you. And so that's the C picture. So here's that C picture again for reflexive control. The spinal cord and brainstem both have reflexory control that allow for responses that are quicker, that could be provided under cortical control. So if you think about this, the book talks about an example. The real obvious reflex that everyone knows is the patellar reflex, right? Like you sit on a table and your knees are hanging off, and the doctor hits it with a little rubber tomahawk thing, right? So that reflex is a fast reflex. It involves the spinal cord and the muscle. It happens in milliseconds. It happens faster than if I say move your hand, go. If I say move your leg, go, it takes you quite a bit longer to cortically voluntarily move. And that's useful. Like if something's coming at you, you want to duck or get out of the way quickly. You don't want to wait and think about it. So this is an automated response. Although this automated response can be inhibited by the cortex. So this patellar reflex, that's the one with the knee tap, is a really simple one. It's actually monosynaptic. And what that means is there's only one synapse in the whole pathway. The spindle has an afferent that's going up towards the spinal cord. It synapses back on the alpha motor neuron, the same one that's going out to the extrafusal fibers of the same muscle. And so this is used to correct for responses to forces. And so here, for instance, as this weight is dropped into your hand, you correct, right? So like here, your hand, you're just maintaining force against gravity, right? You have to exert your muscles to a certain level while there's nothing in them. Now, as this object is in, the muscle strength is not enough to hold your arm up, so your arm goes down, and now you correct to have the right tone to keep at this position. If that tone was any stronger, if the muscle contracted more, then you would move up past this horizontal position, and if it was any less, then you'd stay down here. And so this system is correcting for those forces. And that would be really useful in some real basic things like maintaining posture, right? Or like if you hold a glass, you want to hold it hard enough to not drop it. You want to not hold it so hard that you crush it, right? So you need to be able to maintain an appropriate force level, and that's what the system can do for you. And that's monosynaptically. That happens well below the level of the brain. The gamma motor system, so here we talked about this monosynaptic reflex that uses spindle afferents, going back to the alpha motor neuron system. So this is involving the gamma. These spindle afferents are gamma system and the alpha system. And so this is how the gamma and alpha systems coordinate. And the way that works is kind of interesting. So when you want to move a limb, like say you want to raise your arm, the gamma and alpha systems actually initiate simultaneously when the motion is directed from the brain. So the inside of the muscle fiber, the muscle, and the outside of the muscle, they both start firing. In the low resistance situations, the extrafusal and the intrafusal muscle fibers largely contract together. The arm goes up, the muscle fibers contract together, and nothing interesting happens. But if there's a high resistance situation, for geometric reasons, the muscle spindle contracts more than the extrafusal muscles. And this will trigger monosynaptic reflexive strengthening of the response, which needs to happen quickly. So in these higher situations, in these higher resistance situations, you get contraction that's differential between the intrafusal and extrafusal muscles, and that results in strengthening the response so that they're proportional, which means that the alpha motor neuron fires more or less, which are more in the case of high resistance, which causes maintenance of tone again. So again, the purpose here is to exert the right force, because too much force and this object would move up. Remember your physics class, force equals mass times acceleration, right? So for instance, if this is a 100-gram mass, it exerts a force downward of 100 grams times 9.8 meters per second squared. So there's a force in newtons that's being exerted down, or in pounds or whatever. The force that's up needs to be the same. So in order for this not to move, in order for acceleration to be zero, meaning if the arm is pushing up on the object harder than the object is pushing down, the object goes up. If the object is pushing down harder than the arm is pushing up, the object goes down. So you need to maintain those forces. Similarly, you need to maintain forces for posture so that you stay standing on your feet rather than falling over one way or the other. Those are monosynaptic reflexes. Those are the really simple ones. There are reflexes that are quite a bit more complicated, that involve multiple synapses, and these include brainstem reflexes in particular. So brainstem reflexes coordinate afferent information coming in from the cranial nerves with different responses going back out through the cranial nerves. So a really simple example is the gag reflex. And so the gag reflex involves a sensory component, that's the sensation of the presence of the object in the back of the throat. And then it involves a motor response, which is the physical response. The eye blink is a brainstem reflex. And so if you touch my eye, I blink. Like if something gets in my eye, I blink automatically. It's a brainstem reflex. There's a sense that's coming from the eye, and then there's an efferent response, which is the eyelid closing. So that's again a brainstem reflex. And these typically involve multiple synapses, though. They're not monosynaptic. What I mean by that is, in the case of the monosynaptic reflex for the patellar response, the sensory fiber goes back and it synapses with the same alpha motor neuron that was already going in. So there's just one synapse between the sensory fiber and the alpha motor neuron. These have more than one. And so here's an example of that. Here, information is coming from the Golgi tendon organ. It's synapsing here. There's an interneuron, it's synapsing again to this inhibitory interneuron, and also it's being modulated by this other intrafusal information. And so there are multiple synapses going on here between the interneuron in orange and the Golgi tendon neuron in light green, between the interneuron and the inhibitory neuron, between the inhibitory neuron and the sensory one from the intrafusal fibers. So those are polysynaptic reflexes. And I do want to mention though, so here we're talking about path length. So the path length here involves 1, 2 synapses and then back to the muscle. That's what I mean when I call it monosynaptic or polysynaptic. It's how many synapses are in the path length, not how many synapses there are all together. So when you have a patellar reflex, there's not just one neuron necessarily that goes back afferently or one efferent neuron. There can be many, like there are many efferent neurons that handle different motor units of the muscle fiber that moves your knee. But there's one synapse in the path length, which is the afferent synapse back on the alpha motor neuron. Each of them only has that one synapse in the pathway, even though there are many of them doing the same thing. Does that make sense? Understand that? So that's the motor system, the very simple reflexive control that happens in the spinal cord of the brainstem. And some points to drive home from this part of the lecture are that, one, the motor system has a lot of control at the level of the spinal cord and the brainstem. It can actually do quite a bit without going into the cerebral cortex. It can maintain posture. There are lots of reflexory responses that happen at the spinal cord. These things are all there because they need to happen very quickly, and they can involve a many synapse kind of process in the cortex. But of course, cortical control is very important. Later on, we'll be talking about neurological diseases, and especially in neurological diseases that affect older adults, one important sign is the loss of cortical inhibition of primitive reflexes. So for instance, for those of you who work with children or infants, there's a reflex called the Babinski reflex. And so adults and children do something different when you stimulate the soft part of the under part of the foot, the sole of the foot. The Babinski reflex is the down-going toes and spread out toes that infants do. That Babinski response is inhibited by the brain outside of infants. And so generally speaking, you don't see that Babinski response in adults. Like if I take a nail or something and I run it down the bottom of your foot, you don't show that Babinski response. That Babinski response does become present again with neurological injuries. It becomes present in acute traumatic brain injury. It can become present in certain kinds of lesions that affect part of the cerebral motor system. Similarly, you have a lot of other reflexes that you can inhibit. So an example is if I come up to you and I tap you here in between the eyes like this, you're going to blink, right? If I keep tapping you, you're going to stop blinking. So you inhibit that reflex. That inhibitory control is coming from the frontal lobe, from the brain. It's an abnormal sign in an older adult with dementia if you keep blinking when you do that, because the reflex is not inhibited. And so it's abnormal because the reflex is supposed to be inhibited, as opposed to things like the cranial nerve reflexes, which are supposed to be there in intact adults, and so you're looking for them to be absent. So it's clinically really interesting, both when a reflex is absent when it's supposed to be there, and when a reflex is present when it's not supposed to be there. If you look at the clinical examination of these reflexes, the reflex like the patellar reflex is called a deep tendon reflex. Those reflexes actually do have quite a bit of variability, and there's a grading scale that people like neurologists use. There are some different grading scales, but one of them, for instance, uses like a 1+ and 2+. So a 2+ is a brisk response. It's a relatively strong kick, for instance, with a patellar response. There's normal variability in these responses, much like there's normal variability in intellect or height or eye color. So, for instance, a 2+ patellar reflex is not necessarily abnormal. It's abnormal if it's asymmetric. So what you're looking for there is not so much whether the reflex is strong or weak in one knee, but if it's different from knee to knee. Although there are injuries that can affect both knees at the same time, you're more interested in whether they're asymmetric. So there are different things you can look at for the reflexes clinically, whether they're absent, when they're supposed to be present, when they're present, when they're supposed to be absent, and whether they're asymmetric is another really important one. Okay. Motor functions. So there are lots of pieces to motor control that we're not discussing in today's lecture. It's hard to kind of condense motor control down into a 2 or 3 hour lecture, but I do want to hit some high points that you have to be aware of. And so there's things about the reflexory control and the mechanistic control of muscle fibers that we didn't get into today. There's some really interesting things like fast twitch and slow twitch fibers that we don't have a chance to talk about today. But I do want to hit some high points, and I kind of followed what the book considered high points as kind of a guideline of what to hit on here in terms of understanding this component of how the brain works. So let's move on to brain control of motion. And really, in my mind, this part's the more interesting part of the lecture because you really, again, are specialized in comparison to other animals by the array of complex behaviors you can engage in and the extent to which those behaviors are chosen to match contexts. And so that's all cerebral control. That's not a spinal kind of function. But you need to understand how the muscles work and how motor control works at the mechanistic level to be able to understand this higher cortical control of motor functions. So let's move on into the brain. So cerebral control, the kind of most important structure to start with is the precentral gyrus. This is the gyrus that runs across the brain this way, so you can visualize it well in a coronal plane. That is directly in front of the central gyrus, the central sulcus, and it's also directly, therefore, in front of the sensory cortex. So the primary sensory cortex is the postcentral gyrus behind the central sulcus. The precentral gyrus is the motor cortex in front of the central sulcus, in the frontal lobe. Again, it's somatotopically organized. It's a place code. The body is mapped out in space onto the motor cortex, just like in the sensory cortex. And there's a homunculus again. And just like in the sensory cortex, this motor homunculus is organized in essentially a parallel fashion, meaning that sensory structures are adjacent to motor structures that serve the same parts of the body. Like the sensory homunculus, area in the cortex is not proportional to the size of the body part, meaning your back doesn't have a very large motor homunculus component, just like it didn't have a very large sensory homunculus component, because there's not a lot of fine-grained variations in what you do with your back. The functionally important parts have disproportionately large portions of the motor cortex. And those are going to be your hands, your fingers, your motor control of speech. And so, and I'll show you that in just a second, sorry. And this organization is based on how you move body parts, not on individual muscles, and that's an important concept. So the book gives this example, the book chapter gives this example that if you stimulate a motor strip area in a monkey briefly, it generates a simple motion like flexing or releasing the hand. But if you stimulate it for a longer period of time, that same region will actually engage in a complex functional behavior. What I mean by functional is there's a real world use for this behavior. And so for instance, you can cause an automated motion like grasping and bringing the hand to the mouth, for instance, for eating. So that longer stimulation engages in a functional behavior. It's not focused on the muscles that close the hand. It's focused on the motor behavior, which is bringing the hand to the mouth. And so that's the way that information is organized at the level of the motor cortex, as opposed to the level of the spinal cord, where each spinal cord root for the motor system, the ventral roots, trigger certain sets of muscles. But here it's coordination among muscles that function to move body parts. And the motor cortex is subject to a lot of sophisticated modulation and refinement. It's kind of like the person who has 1,000 bosses. The frontal lobe, the prefrontal cortex, the thalamus, the basal ganglia, the cerebellum. Lots of different structures are modulating and refining the motor cortex, which is actually triggering these motions. and functional behaviors. So here is a graphical representation of that. Again, central sulcus, so central sulcus is right here. All the structures that are colored in here are forward of the central sulcus. So this is the sensory strip, and this is the motor strip in pink. And then these are premotor and supplementary motor areas that we'll talk about in a moment. So there was a sensory homunculus in this gyrus. Now there's a motor homunculus in a pink gyrus, and that's shown here. And again, this funny looking person, what the funny looking person is meant to represent is that parts of the body that are highly motorically important, hands, feet, mouth, larynx and pharynx, these things that are important and complicated behaviors, and what you do with your hands and your speaking are your most complicated behaviors. So those areas have large representation. And so for instance, if we find the thumb and the fingers, you see they take up a huge amount of space. And then in contrast, say like the whole shoulder and arm are just this little part here, and notice in contrast how much the hand controls like all of this. And the leg, you can see, is not very much, but the toes are proportionally larger. So again, areas that are motorically important, large distribution on the cortex. Areas that are not motorically important, relatively small distribution. And that distribution is based on moving the body parts and not based on muscles. And as mentioned, if you stimulate a motor cortex area, it will cause complex behaviors in the monkey. So not just moving one muscle, not flexing a muscle, but engaging in these real world behaviors like reaching to grasp, climbing or leaping, manipulating something in closed space, manipulating something in far away space, defensive postures, bringing the hand to mouth. So these are complex behaviors that are being stimulated by the motor cortex. The tracts from the motor cortex to the body, these efferent tracts, and I want to apologize here. This very first slide in this lecture was wrong. That's this one. Sensory efferent, motor efferent. The rest of them should be correct. And you can double check this with your book. But I had this backwards on the slide, and I paused there for a moment. But I didn't have it straight in my head while I was talking. But that was backwards in that slide. And correct in this slide here. So the efferents, efferents, or descending tracts are the motor pathways from the brain to the body. And so they're sometimes called descending tracts. There are two groups of descending tracts, a lateral and a ventromedial group. Remember, lateral and medial, so away from the midline, that's lateral, towards the midline, that's medial. Remember ventral as opposed to dorsal. The belly surface of the body was the ventral surface. The back surface of the body was the dorsal surface. We talked about how, generally speaking, the rear part of the spine, the dorsal part of the spine, is a sensory part of the spine, and the ventral part of the spine is a motor part of the spine. So there's a ventromedial motor component, and there's also a lateral motor component. And each of these have several different tracts in them, but we group them this way because they have different kinds of functions. The lateral functions are independent limb movements. So for instance, if I reach and I grab this, that's an independent limb movement. It doesn't have anything to do with any of my other limbs. These are coordinated limb movements and control of the trunk. Can anyone think of an example of a coordinated limb movement? So, for instance, if you're running, right, you're swinging your arms back and forth, that's a coordinated limb movement. It doesn't make any sense to run and swing one arm back and forth and hold the other at your side. It's a coordination of the two limbs. But also as you're running, your legs are moving in opposition, like one foot is forward and one foot is back. Your limbs are moving in coordination with each other, not independently. That's a ventromedial function as opposed to the independent movement. So if you kick a soccer ball, that's an independent movement. But if you walk, that's a coordinated movement. And a lot of these coordinated movements are postural, like you pump your arms while you're running in order to help with your balance and your speed. And control of your trunk, again, is a postural kind of tool. And consistent with this is that these ventromedial postural tracts, a lot of them end up in kind of high suspect places like the vestibular system. The tectum also is a brainstem system that is going to be involved in these more basic, the brainstem is involved in a lot of posture and maintenance kinds of roles. Whereas this stuff, a lot of this is going straight up to the cortex. So the corticospinal tract is the most important of these tracts. And this tract is primarily composed of fibers that descend from the primary motor cortex. That was this, right? Primary motor cortex, the precentral gyrus. Those descending fibers form the corticospinal tract. The corticospinal tract starts in the cortex, it comes down, it actually splits in two. So there's a lateral corticospinal tract that splits and decussates in the brainstem, crosses sides, and then continues down the other side of the spine. There's also the ventromedial portion of the corticospinal tract. That portion stays ipsilateral. So the lateral corticospinal tract that splits out and goes contralateral, that's the 80% of the corticospinal tract. That 80%, that big part of the corticospinal tract, is responsible for things like coordinated movements of arms, hands, and fingers. And here I don't mean coordination of multiple limbs, but I mean coordination like within the limb, like grasping or reaching or turning. These are coordinated praxis kinds of motions. And that's the lateral corticospinal tract. This one, that's part of independent limb movements and also things like fine motor control. And that's the one that splits over and decussates to the other side of the brain, of the spinal cord. I'm trying to read here. So, I'm sorry. It's the one that decussates and splits over to the other side of the brain. Some of these other ones decussate also, like the rubrospinal tract. It's the light blue in this picture. That's the lateral corticospinal tract. And it's the dark blue that's the ventral corticospinal tract. So you see it's ventral, it's on the front surface. This is the front of the body, the belly side. This is the back. These are the dorsal columns that handle touch that are in the back side. And then this is lateral, it's away from the midline. And this one is ventral, meaning it's in the belly side, and it's medial, meaning it's towards the midline. I want to only briefly mention the two other lateral tracts. So the lateral grouping here in the lateral region of the spinal cord, there's a corticobulbar tract. It's conceptually similar to the lateral corticospinal tract. It's this one in red. The difference between the lateral corticospinal tract and the corticobulbar tract is that the corticobulbar tract projects via cranial nerves to the muscles of the head, face, neck, and tongue, whereas the lateral corticospinal tract goes down into the spine and projects via spinal roots to the muscles of the body. So same idea, but this one handles contralateral head, neck, and tongue, face, neck, tongue muscles, and this one handles contralateral hands and arms and fingers. The other lateral tract is the rubrospinal tract. It runs from the red nucleus, that's the rubber part here, and it controls the muscles of the forearms and the hands, but not the fingers. And there's an interesting phenomenon in serious brain injuries that's relevant to this, and that's this phenomenon of decerebrate and decorticate posture. So the decorticate posture is this one, and the decerebrate posture is this one. The difference between these is actually due to the function of this rubrospinal tract. And so it's a localizing in the sense that essentially if the rubrospinal tract is intact, which is the decorticate posture, it tells you that the brain is working up from the bottom to the level of the red nucleus, whereas if it's a decerebrate posture, then it's impaired even below the level of the red nucleus. And so sometimes in acute brain injury, you use this as an indicator of severity. It's really, really gross, and gross in the sense that it's rough. But this tells you how far down the brainstem the injury is. And that's bad. You don't want an injury that involves your brain being dysfunctional all the way down into the brainstem to begin with. But the further down the brainstem it is, the less likely that there's going to be a good outcome.
So which one is worse?
The decerebrate is worse than the decorticate because it involves more brainstem damage. I think I got that right. Yeah, so, and the names mean decorticate means the cortex is not working. Decerebrate means the whole cerebrum or brain isn't working, essentially. So those are the lateral tracts. These are the ones that run in the lateral part of the spinal cord. They run contralaterally, and they primarily handle a lot of these coordinated, these independent movements within the limb. Then the medial tracts are primarily tracts that handle things like posture and body coordination that's used to maintain things like gait and station, like your ability to walk and stand. The vestibulospinal tract coordinates postural responses with vestibular data. So what's going on here is that you are going up to the vestibular system. Remember we talked about the vestibular system last week, which is the system that handles balance by telling you if the body is accelerating. So remember we talked about the two different kinds of vestibular organs, the semicircular canals and the utricle and saccule. And what these do is they detect angular and linear accelerations. And so you can coordinate posture with acceleration. So for instance, conceptually, if you're in an elevator and it starts accelerating up and your body braces, it's a vestibulospinal kind of function. Or like if you're in a bus and the bus starts moving and your body braces so that you don't fall over, it's a vestibulospinal kind of function. The tectospinal tract runs to the tectum, and what it does is it coordinates eye movements with head and trunk movements. So for instance, if you take a person who's very impaired and you move their head, their eyes rotate in the sockets, and so that's the function essentially. So like if I'm looking at you, as I'm turning my head, I keep looking at you, that's a tectospinal kind of function. The reticulospinal function, this is the brainstem reticular formation, not the reticular nucleus of the thalamus. The brainstem reticular formation's control of posture. So like you're maintaining an upright posture while you're awake, and when you fall asleep, you fall over. So that's a reticulospinal function. And then the ventral corticospinal tract, the one that's separated out from the lateral corticospinal tract, it carries lower limb information ipsilaterally. So just to summarize all of those, the lateral and the ventromedial group, I think that this has some additional divisions in there. It talks about what the functions are of these. And you see here, walking, posture, those are the kind of functions here. Coordination of eye movement, like for instance, this could also be things like as you're walking, making sure your eyes continue to look forward. As you're walking, your head's moving, but you continue to look forward. These are all the kinds of functions that the ventromedial group does. If you look at the lateral group, grasping, manipulating, using the forearms and hands, the face and the tongue. So a lot of the high area distribution parts of the motor homunculus go down through the lateral group. What I want to draw your attention to here is, the hands and arms, the face and mouth. These things are all lateral group functions. The body posture is a ventral group function, and so this lateral group is really important for these complex motions. The ventral group is more important for things like posture and interface. So, before I continue, any questions about these motor pathways? I don't want, again here the point is not to memorize every point along the motor pathway, but I do want to give you at least a flavor for how there are different tracts that descend from the brain to the body that control different things. And some of these tracts also explain why in certain kinds of injuries there can be aspects of functioning that are preserved. And so they're potentially interesting from that standpoint as well. Modulation of motor behavior. So, as I noted several times, there's extensive modulation of behavior, meaning selecting among behaviors, refining behaviors, making subtle differentiations between behaviors and sensory inputs. There's a lot of this modulation that's going on. And there are a number of structures that are involved in modulation. The supplementary motor area and the premotor cortex, along with the medial prefrontal cortex, are primarily involved in modulation in the sense of planning multi-step sequenced actions, right? And so an example of, kind of a really basic example of a multi-step sequence action, if you think about like a baseball player, like a professional pitcher in a baseball game, pitches, so there's lots of different body motions that go into pitching. It's a sequence, right? They have a wind-up, they put back, they throw the ball, and that kind of throw is incredibly effective. So the professional baseball player can throw a 90-mile-an-hour pitch. Their throw is much harder than if you just take the ball and you throw it. Although even throwing it like that is a coordinated multi-step sequence. You're doing multi-step sequences all day. You have a multi-step sequence to turn on your computer and log in. You have a multi-step sequence to drive to class if you drive, or walk to class if you walk, right? These are all multi-step sequential actions, meaning one step comes after the other. Like you unlock the door and then you open it and then you walk through. You don't walk through before you unlock the door, or unlock the door after you've opened it, right? So they're sequential and they involve multiple steps. And those are the kinds of tasks that these prefrontal and frontal cortex structures, all these structures are in front of the motor strip. That's what they do. In a very broad sense, the basal ganglia are involved in filtering and selecting or deselecting motor plans. That is, choosing which action to take. So here you're sequencing the actions, you're putting them together. Like for instance, you know that you want to do the electric slide, and so you know that there are these steps that go in a certain order. Those same steps are all dance steps, but they're not the electric slide unless you do them in order. That's what's happening here. What's happening here, for instance, is more like you're selecting steps that don't belong in that dance, and you're getting rid of them. You're only using the ones that actually belong in that dance. And then in the cerebellum, you're smoothing your motor plan, and so you're not doing those steps in isolation. You're stitching them together into actual dancing instead of just individual moves that are done in isolation, right? And so just in the context of dancing, doesn't have to be the electric slide, right? It could be ballet. You're using each of these three areas to refine that behavior so it looks like a dance and not just a simple motion of the body.
What's the SMA?
Supplementary motor area, and so here, supplementary motor area, it's this part, it's dorsal and relatively medial, and it's anterior to the motor strip. And there's also a pre-supplementary motor area, pre-SMA, SMA, and then this part, when we talk about premotor cortex, this is the premotor cortex. The medial prefrontal cortex is up here, even further anterior. Good question. So these are all anterior structures of the brain in front of the motor strip that are modulating behavior. Whereas the basal ganglia are down here, and the interior cerebellum is back here. So, so the cerebellum is involved in the smoothing of motor plans. Now let's take a closer look at each of these three kinds of modulations of motor behavior. First of all, as we're doing that, let me mention that in order to modulate motor behavior, you need some information, right? Like you need sensory information that tells you what to plan for. And so the prefrontal cortex and the premotor cortex and the pre-supplementary and supplementary motor areas, all of these areas are sequencing events based on detection of both external and internal sensory information. For instance, in that example of the dance, you have to listen to the song to know where you're supposed to be in the dance. You have to know where your limbs are to know where you want to move them. You have to use memory, for instance, to recall, how the dance is supposed to work, and what's coming next and so forth. So using all that sensory information, go into the frontal cortex, and then these structures are planning the sequence of events and telling the motor cortex to execute that sequence of events in the correct order. So the supplementary motor area and the premotor cortex are fed by temporal association cortex and parietal association cortex. So we talked about the what and the where streams. In this previous picture, if we refresh our memories from 2 weeks ago, vision comes up from the lateral geniculate nucleus to the upper and lower occipital lobes, right? And you have this visual map in the occipital lobe. From there, with visual perceptual processing, there's a where stream that goes dorsally that tells you where objects are located. There's a what stream that goes ventrally that tells you what the objects are. We talked about how the auditory system is similarly organized. Again, after basic sound perception, there is a what and where stream that are relatively ventral and dorsal within the temporal lobe and the related structures. So those what streams and where streams were going forward, where and what, they're now coming back together in the frontal cortex. So here they're splitting out for these different kinds of perceptions, but now what and where are being reintegrated in order to respond to them. So for instance, you see an object flying towards you, right? The where it is it's coming down, it's coming towards you. So the what it is could be that it's a baseball and you're wearing a catcher's glove. And so you put your hand up and you catch the ball. That's an example of a planned sequence of motor events in response to the what and the where streams. The sequence of motor events could be different though. Like that thing coming towards you could be an arrow, which you don't want to catch. Or it could be a bird dive bombing at you. You don't want to catch those things, right? So you want a different motor sequence, which will involve getting out of the way. And so here again, that what and the where streams. The where in this case is the same. It's still coming down towards you, but now the what is different and it's causing a different motor function to be triggered. So that's a little bit kind of hokey, but those are some examples of how you're choosing different movements. You might look at a chessboard and you could ask the what is the other player's queen, and the where will determine whether or not you want to respond by trying to block that queen or take it or get out of the way, right? And so again, the what and the where come together and you plan the appropriate response, which in this case would be making your chess move. So the what and the where streams come back together. And in terms of breaking down what these structures do just a little bit, the supplementary motor area does seem to plan for upcoming steps in a known sequence. For instance, a known sequence might be like if you're a musician, a really well-known sequence would be a major scale, right? And so you know that the first two notes, like there's a whole step and a whole step and a half step. You know how a major scale sounds, you know where the sharps and the flats fit. So it's a well-known sequence. You know that if you are playing a C major scale and you're playing an E, the next note is an F. So disruption of the supplementary motor area in animals and people causes trouble remembering how to complete the learned multi-step manual sequence. So for example, if I teach a monkey a multi-step sequence and then I disrupt the SMA, in the middle, they don't know what steps come after the step that they've finished. That's different from impairing the ability to engage in the actual steps. So for instance, suppose that, let's stick with the music example. Suppose the steps are playing C, D, and E. So if I tell you to play C, you can play C. If I tell you to play D, you can play D. If I tell you to play E, you can play E. And if I tell you them in the right order, you're playing them still in a C major scale. But you can't come up with a sequence, that's the difference yourself. So it's not your ability to play C, D, and E, but it's your ability to know that the sequence in that case is C, D, E, and not D, E, C, or something else. You can type all the letters in your password, but you can't type them in the right order in order to log into your computer. So it's a sequence that's impaired. And there's some interesting things about it. First of all, it seems to be bilateralized very quickly, meaning if you're taught a sequence, you're taught a sequence with your right hand, you're actually sending that information to the right hemisphere, because your right hand is controlled by your left hemisphere. The right hemisphere is getting a share of that information even before the actual motor action is carried out. And so in the example that the book provides, remember we're talking about transcranial magnetic stimulation, basically temporarily knocking out or lesioning a structure in the brain. So if you stimulate the learning hemisphere prior to each hand motion, it prevents the non-dominant hand from getting that transfer of information. But if you stimulate the learning center during each hand motion, you don't have this effect because it's already gone to the other side. And so, for instance, if I teach you to type a keyboard sequence with your right hand, even before you press, like say the keyword sequence is Y-E-S for yes, even before you press the Y, your left hand knows that part of the sequence. Even before you press the E, your left hand knows that part of the sequence. Even before you press the S, your left hand knows that part of the sequence. So it's rapidly bilateralized. In that picture, there was a pre-supplementary motor area that was even more anterior to the SMA. And that's involved in the desire to move or the initiation. And it may be something that explains part of how apathy works. Apathy is a lack of initiation or a lack of desired motivated behavior. And apathy is, especially in neurological populations, dissociable from depression, meaning depressed people can be apathetic, but you can actually be apathetic without depression. These people will sort of sit around all day and they won't do anything. They can do all those things, but they don't have the desire to initiate behavior. And so the book talks about a functional imaging study where people are essentially told to press a button whenever they want to. And so they press the button, some of them press it a lot, some of them press it a little. The desire to move precedes the actual initiation of the movement, and it happens in the pre-SMA region. The premotor cortex is, again, this structure that's more lateral here, and medial for the supplementary motor area. This lateral structure in green is the premotor cortex, and it's involved in using sensory information to select a motor plan based on learning. And so it makes sense that it sits in between this frontal integration of senses and the motor strip. So it uses the sensory information to pick the plan based on the learning. So for example, if you have monkeys and you teach them to move a hand with a directional visual signal, the directional visual signal, what I mean here is sort of like the arrow points to the left, you move your left hand. The information about what you're supposed to do is coded conceptually in that. You know, like, for instance, it's kind of the reason that cars work the way they work. You turn the steering wheel this way to go that way is it's kind of hard-coded into it, the logic of how it works. You really don't have to teach people that you have to turn the wheel that way. You don't have to teach people that if you want to turn the page on an iPad, you swipe across it. So those are examples of these directional signals. As opposed to, I could have an arbitrary visual signal, like I could decide that green means left and red means right. That's an arbitrary visual signal. It depends on the protocol or communication format. You know, whereas if you have an arrow pointing left, it's usually going to mean left. It's not usually going to mean right. So the monkeys learn to move their hand with the visual directional signal and the arbitrary visual signal. If the premotor cortex is impaired, the arbitrary signal is impaired. The reason the arbitrary signal is impaired is because there needs to be a learned response to it, and that learned response to the sensory information is what the premotor cortex does. And so if you inhibit the premotor cortex, if you knock it out, that response to the arbitrary signal is also knocked out. There's a similar study that's described in the textbook where humans are given weights to pick up and hold, and some of the weights are light and some of the weights are heavy, and there's given a visual cue. The visual cue is arbitrary. I think it's like the light blue dot is the light object and the dark blue dot is the heavy object. That's an arbitrary code. You don't automatically assume the light blue dot is lighter. I guess it could be like a blue dot and a red dot again. But the point is that it's not an obvious visual cue. Like if the visual cue was a big circle and a little circle, you would expect the structure to be a big structure and a little structure. This is an arbitrary visual cue. So humans get the arbitrary visual cue. They're not told what it means. They get these objects. They quickly learn that one visual cue tells you the object will be light, one visual cue tells you the object will be heavy, and so they automatically and quickly modulate their exertion to match the object that they're going to get. So if you temporarily knock out the premotor cortex with the RTMS, then what will happen is using these arbitrary visual cues, they won't be able to predict, so they won't respond based on the expectation of what the object would weigh. And this is kind of interesting because if you walk them through how this kind of task works, they probably can describe an analog of this kind of task. It's not it's not that they can't think about it, it's not that they're stupid, it's that their brain, the part of their brain that is using sensory information and learning to modulate motor behavior is not functioning. And that's the outcome. So there's another neurological underpinning to these cortical, especially these frontal controls of the brain that's important to know about, and that's called the mirror neuron system. The mirror neuron system are neurons that fire not when you do something, but not just when you do something, but when you observe something. And so that observation could be visual or it could be through another sense. But when you observe the motor plan, especially if you're familiar with the motor plan, then you activate the mirror neurons. And this is a social learning tool. In terms of the familiarity, the book gives an example. Ballet dancing is a good example because ballet dancing involves men and women, but their roles are structured so that there are certain dance moves that male and female ballet dancers do, and there are certain dance moves that only men do and certain dance moves that only women do, right? And so if you show a dance move that men and women both do, then the mirror neuron system fires similarly in men and women. But if you show men a dance move that only men do, they show a strong response in the mirror neuron system. The women show a weaker response for that same move because they're not highly familiar with it, because they've seen it, but they don't do it. And vice versa. So if you show a female ballet move, the men will show a weaker mirror neuron activation because they see it, but they don't do it. The women will show a stronger mirror neuron activation. So similarly, your mirror neurons are going to be activated, for instance, if you watch someone play guitar, but they'll be much more strongly activated if you know how to play guitar yourself. And that kind of makes sense because the more you get into an activity, the more you're learning and actively engaged in learning. And so you can learn through observation. When you're talking, the more you talk, the more your mirror neurons are primed to fire in response to watching other people talk, and your talking skills become more refined. And so this is an underpinning of that social learning of speech, for instance. Mirror neurons are located in the premotor cortex. They're also located in other places like sensory association cortex. And they fire in a pattern that's conceptually similar to the motor planning pattern when the activity is observed. And so essentially what they're doing is they're training the path of the planning pathway that would cause the same action. So here we talked about these sensory modalities, the what and where stream, and then a plan for movement, and then that plan gets executed. All along here are mirror neurons. Those mirror neurons are responding to perception of the same stimuli, responding to observation of other people engaging in the same movements, and then ultimately what they're doing is training that pathway which would cause that same response in you to that same movement. So this is a biological mechanism for learning through social modeling. It explains, for instance, why You can watch someone do something and be able to do that thing that you saw them do. That's the system. There have been some people who think that in the case of autism, for instance, this system is important to understand, although there are some counter arguments to that that are made as well. Like one counter argument would be, this is kind of at a hand-waving level, when you look at autism, for instance, people with autism have trouble with reciprocal social behaviors, right? But the high-functioning ones can tell you what those social behaviors are supposed to look like. They can even tell you when they're supposed to happen. That doesn't mean they happen fluidly or readily or automatically. In fact, these people will tell you, the high-functioning ones tell you that they kind of act their way through life by doing these things because they know they're supposed to happen conceptually, but they don't automatically and naturally happen. That would suggest their ability to learn to acquire the sequence of behaviors is normal, but their ability to use them spontaneously is somehow, some other way, kind of normal. But these are something we're still learning about, and mirror neurons are important for child development in particular, because these underpin a wide variety of social learning that you engage in throughout childhood, whether it's learning to talk, gesture, interact with other people, play. You're learning all these things in part by observing other people do them. I mentioned earlier that you're going to understand the motion better if you're familiar with it. You're also going to understand the motion if it makes conceptual sense better, right? So if you're a musician, you understand playing a piano, you are going to respond to hand motions over the piano that mimic notes. You're not going to respond to hand motions over the piano that don't correspond to playing a piano. Because these are just hand motions with a piano in the background. This is playing piano, right? So this is not particularly useful in learning how to play the piano, but this might be. As far as motor behaviors, there are some specific motor behaviors that are important to understand. Reaching and grasping are two specific manual behaviors that are driven by the aware stream, this dorsal stream that handles location. And there's some specific parietal cortical structures that are involved in this process. There's a parietal reach region, and that's a medial posterior parietal lobe region. It's a parietal lobe region that plans for reaching for pointing to a certain part of space. And so this is actually planning that's happening starting the parietal lobe. The aware stream, so the aware stream tells you there's an object over here, say for instance, then this parietal reach region is getting the motor plan, helping getting the motor plan ready to reach over for where that object is. And that needs a translation between external and internal space, because in the external space the object is here. You need to know how that relates to your arms. You need to know, for instance, that this arm can reach it, as opposed to this arm which may not be able to reach it. And so you need to translate that to the interior body space. Or you might need to turn to reach it and so forth. And then the posterior parietal structure, that's called the anterior interparietal sulcus. This one directs grasping. So reaching, grasping, and so these are some specific motor behaviors that are obviously really important for primates, whether it's to grasp a hold of something to pull yourself up, to grasp an object flying at you, to grasp a berry that's good to eat off of a tree or bush, those kinds of things. Here's a picture of those structures in the parietal lobe. Posterior parietal lobe, meaning that way. The posterior, this again is the postcentral gyrus. This is the sensory cortex. This is the motor cortex. Further back are these parietal structures that are part of the aware stream that help with planning motor activities related to reaching and grasping. Sorry, reaching and then grasping here. So, reaching and grasping are two important motor activities. Praxis is a general category of motor activities that involve skilled movement. And when you lack praxis, it's called apraxia, sometimes also dyspraxia. Just as an aside in terms of terminology, you'll hear lots of words in physiology and psychology that have dys and a in the front. There are two different uses for those prefixes, which causes a lot of headaches. And the way that those work is, I pause for a second. have dis and a in front of them. There are two different meanings that are attributed to these, and unfortunately people use them somewhat inconsistently. One is a developmental meaning, and one is essentially a completeness or severity meaning. So in the developmental meaning, what these mean are, dis means that it's essentially in development, and a means acquired. And in the severity sense, dis means it's partial, and a means it's complete. So, to give you some examples of this, if you say dysgraphia, it could mean that you have deficits in writing but you can write, whereas agraphia means you can't do any writing. Dyslexia means that you have trouble reading developmentally, like it's a condition from birth, or in your brain from birth, and developmentally you can't read. Alexia happens after a stroke that affects reading structures that causes you to not be able to read. And that's where this gets confusing, because sometimes people mean the A to mean acquired, and sometimes they mean it to mean complete. You kind of have to know the context. For instance, dyslexia almost always means a developmental issue, and sometimes people will even say developmental dyslexia to make that clearer. Yeah, and so what's kind of odd about this is, so in that context, alexia almost always means acquired reading problems. And then these are used, there are some situations where usually these terms are used. So I want to kind of mention that, if you see the dis and the a, be on the lookout for what people are talking about, because they may be talking about one of these or the other. And it can be kind of hard to tell which. If I return here, to return to that concept, here we're using it in the sense of the acquired versus developmental. And so here, apraxia means that a lesion, like a stroke or something like that, causes loss of praxis. Dyspraxia means that the praxis deficit is developmental. And so for instance, kids would typically have dyspraxia, and older adults would typically have apraxia. So apraxia, which means loss of the ability to carry out sequence-skilled movements, can be caused by damage to the frontal lobe or the parietal cortex, and it's usually the dominant or left hemisphere in most right-handed people. And the reason for this essentially, it seems to be because there's a specialization between the hemispheres where, that I'll get to in a second, but basically it's sort of like unilateral neglect, which is usually caused by right hemispheric lesions. Apraxia is usually caused by left hemispheric lesions. There are 4 kinds of apraxia. There's limb apraxia, which is a problem with limb, hand, and finger motions. There's oral apraxia, which is a problem with motor construction of speech. There's apraxic agraphia, which is specific to writing, but it's a praxis of writing issue, not an ability to create transfer word meaning, but an ability to coordinate the motions needed to write. And then constructional apraxia, which is specific to assembling, constructing, or drawing objects. So I'd like to show you some examples of those. Of those, limb apraxia is the one that's really commonly tested. And the real common way to test that is imagine motor sequences. So for instance, you ask a person to show me how to hammer a nail, and they do this. That can be a coordinated motion with both hands, like this. Show me how to unlock a door with a key, like this. A really good two-handed one is show me how to fold a piece of paper and put it in an envelope. So they do this, and they do this, and this, and then, maybe, and close the envelope. So it's a coordinated praxis that you can even involve the face. And it uses both hands. And so there are 3 conditions for this kind of test. The hard one is imagining, like show me how to use scissors and you do this. And scissors are a bad example, but one error that you'll see that shows apraxia is called the body part as a tool. So a body part as a tool would be, for instance, showing you that you use scissors like this. Instead of showing you how you use scissors, I'm showing you what scissors do. It's much more convincing if you see it outside of scissors, because lots of normal people will do that with scissors, although usually you can correct them. So for instance, if you want to show me how to hammer a nail, you want them to do this, right? If they do this, that's using a body part as tool. I'm trying to think of another good example of that. Those are some common ones. That's a body part as tool error. So imagining is the hardest condition. You might see that, for instance. Copying a model is progressively easier. So like you might say, show me how to use, to unlock a door with a key. And you expect them to do this, but they're like this or something wrong like that. So here I'm not using the body part as a tool. Here I'm just using the wrong motion. So this would be opening the door. Or they might be like, they might do something even worse. So you say like, okay, let me show you. You do it like this. Can you show me? And then maybe they would do that. And then the easiest version is to actually perform the test with the object. And this is where kind of the rubber meets the road. But you will find in dementias, for instance, and we'll talk more about that later in the term, I think, that people have apraxia. They lose the ability to do coordinated motions. They lose the ability to remember how to open doors with keys. They lose the ability to remember how to turn a stove on, how to work the remote control, and so forth. So as I mentioned, this seems to be hemispherically lateralized. The right hemisphere seems to track the object in external space. So the where stream is very important in the right hemisphere. The left hemisphere tracks the body-centric internal space response. Still where stream, but here it's body-centric, which is your motion. And so praxis is really more visible with left hemispheric lesions, because the left hemisphere is responsible for what your body is doing, and the right hemisphere is responsible for what the external world is doing. And so for instance, with the right hemisphere, they know still that the key to unlock the door is in front of you. They don't know what your hand is supposed to be. There is a kind of dementia called corticobasal degeneration. And one variant of corticobasal degeneration is really prominent, apraxia. Here are some examples. So you could also test praxis with being asked to do these different hand motions. So for instance, can you make a hand motion, or a relatively hard hand motion, and then you see if they can do those hand motions. That's a limb apraxia issue. This is a constructional apraxia issue. I might say, draw an analog clock for me and set the hands so that it says 10:30. And so they're supposed to draw the circle, and the numbers, and the shorthand and the longhand. And so a really good response would have all the numbers in the right places, and the shorthand and the longhand in the right place. Depending on the kind of deficit, you might see that the construction is off. And so here, for instance, the numbers are going in the wrong place. The function of the hands gets distorted. So the construction is off here. Another example of constructional apraxia here is they know what a cube is, but they can't draw one for you. A really common one, another one that you'll do really commonly, many of you have ever heard of or seen the mini mental status examination. So one that's common on that for dementia patients is intersecting pentagons. And so it looks something like this, like that. And so you want them to draw two pentagons with 5 points each. You want them to have, in this picture, like this 4-point intersecting area. The person might do something like, they might draw a pentagon with not enough sides. They might draw the wrong kind of intersection, that kind of thing. There's a figure called the Ray-Alsterreich complex figure, which I'm not going to put up in the notes because it is part of a cognitive test and we don't want everyone to know what it looks like, although it's pretty widely available. It looks something like this. You may have seen this before. I'm not going to draw it super well, but you get the idea. There's right, that's the whole thing actually. I think. Oh, that's what this is. So this is the rasterized complex figure. It's a really relatively complicated constructional task. So constructional apraxia is not knowing how these pieces fit together, for instance. Like not understanding the configural relationships, like this thing is inside this triangle. Not knowing how to put stuff together, like this diamond is supposed to be a diamond and it's supposed to attach, if I draw it correctly, right at the tip of this. So that could be another example of constructional apraxia. An easy, relatively speaking, constructional apraxia task would be like a jigsaw puzzle, for instance. And so it's apraxia when you're not able to do it because of a loss of skill. It's dyspraxia for kids when they're not able to construct these things, for instance. And it's important to know what to expect, for instance, like with that ray figure. Little kids, what I did was called a conceptual ray. I drew like structures at different levels and sizes, and I drew them in such an order that I can draw a relatively good copy. Little kids will draw a really, will use a relatively disorganized pattern that usually results in a poorer copy of the figure. But that's normal in little kids. It's not necessarily pathological. And even in some adults. So you have to be careful to know what to expect. Like most adults in America can draw a cube, for instance. I think another good example with that ray asteroid figure is if you ask someone from the Yucatan Peninsula with 2 years of formal education to draw the ray figure, the idea of like this arbitrary random figure made of triangles is kind of meaningless to them. They think it looks kind of like a fish skeleton because they would, if they're asked to draw something, they're going to be asked to draw something that actually exists in their world. They're going to distort the ray into a fish. Much like if I give you a sentence to copy and I make grammatical errors in it, you'll probably accidentally fix the errors, right? And so you have to be aware of those kinds of things as well in construction. But for instance, say like if a carpenter can't tell you how to make a box out of pieces of wood, that's obviously something that that person should be able to do. So that's praxis, and it's particularly subsumed by left hemispheric frontal and parietal cortex. A few more structures that I want to talk about. The basal ganglia. So the basal ganglia participate in 3 circuits with the frontal lobe. And what's interesting about these circuits is that essentially they function at 3 different speeds. And we're still talking about milliseconds here, but because of the number of neural connections, there's a millisecond level difference between the speeds of these. There's a hyperdirect pathway that's very fast, a direct pathway that's moderately fast, and an indirect pathway which is relatively slow. And each of these circuits involve multiple connections between the basal ganglia structures, the thalamus and the frontal lobe. And some of those structures, some of those interactions are glutamate, and those are excitatory. And some of them are GABAergic, and those are inhibitory. And they sum together for an overall positive or negative impact. And that's an important concept that I want to mention briefly. What I mean by that is, for instance, the same concept that is essentially the same concept that -1 times -1 equals +1, right, in math. That same concept applies here. If a structure inhibits another structure, and you turn around and you inhibit that inhibiting structure, you're exciting the downstream structure because you're inhibiting inhibition, meaning the inhibition is not happening, meaning the structure is excited. If you're exciting an inhibitory structure, the downstream impact +1 times -1 is inhibitory of the downstream structure. I'll show you this in a picture. But you basically then you multiply the minuses and the pluses to determine if the overall impact is positive or negative. And one, the direct pathway is an overall positive impact. The other two are overall negative impacts, meaning these two suppress the cortex from acting. This one enhances the cortex's action. The role of these is essentially to prevent automatic responding, to allow for selection of specific responses, and then most likely to terminate that specific response when they're no longer justified. And actually, people have known about these two pathways for a number of years. This one was actually just determined in the 2000s. And so the hyperdirect pathway was kind of a new surprise. Although the hyperdirect pathway is probably pretty important because it's the one that kind of puts your filter on an activity before it happens. So I want to show you some examples of that and also some pictures. What I mean when I say this is a multiple structure, multiple synapse pathway. So ultimately, all these structures are modulating the frontal cortex here. But the basal ganglia are involved. The caudate nucleus, the putamen, the globus pallidus. The thalamus is involved, and also a structure called the subthalamic nucleus. And without getting into too much detail, the substantia nigra is also involved with dopaminergic neuromodulation. But here, this shows the hyperdirect pathway in black, the direct pathway in red, and the indirect pathway in dashed red. And what you want to know here is that some of these connections are excitatory and some of these connections are inhibitory. And they sum to being an overall excitatory effect on the cortex, exciting towards action in the direct pathway, and an overall inhibitory or inhibiting away from action in the other two pathways. This is a different picture of that. In this picture, the light gray glutamate, these are all excitatory. The dark black are inhibitory. So here, you can understand what I mean. I borrowed this from a Journal of Neuroscience article. If we look at the direct pathway, the direct pathway is this pathway. The indirect pathway is this pathway. You see that the direct pathway has two GABAergic synapses and one glutamatergic synapse. So +1 times -1 times -1 is positive, right? So you're exciting a structure that inhibits a structure that inhibits a structure. And so this inhibition is inhibited, that's excitatory. The direct pathway is excitatory. The indirect pathway has 3 GABAergic synapses and still 1 glutamatergic. So +1 times -1 times -1 times -1 is -1. And so that's an inhibitory effect. And then finally, the hyperdirect pathway has just the 1 GABAergic, again, -1 times +1 times +1 is -1. So excite, inhibit, so the overall effect is inhibitory. Excite, inhibit, the overall effect is excitatory. In this example, they're talking about a Stroop task. The Stroop task is essentially like a Stroop kind of task, or a task that involves doing or not doing something. And so you have to remember what kind of response you're supposed to provide and what kind of response you're not supposed to provide. So the undesired responses are inhibited, the desired responses are enhanced. Another example of this would be like a real common neuropsychological task is verbal fluency. So for instance, I might ask you to name as many animals as you can in a minute, right? And so you could say fox, chipmunk, squirrel, badger. You run out of forest animals, and so you say zebra, elephant, hyena. And you run out of savanna animals, and so you say ocelot, lynx, tiger, and house cat, and so on and so forth, right? All animals that I'm saying. So what's going on neurologically is I've got a semantic lexicon. I got a bunch of knowledge about words. I know some words that are animals and some words that are not animals. And the words that are not animals and the words that are animals are related. For instance, when I think cat, I think paw. But paw is not an animal word. It's not an animal, it's just a part of an animal. When I think cat, I think collar, because my cat wears a collar, right? But again, collar is not a desirable response. So the semantic network activates in a network branching kind of sense. when I think of cat, I'm automatically thinking of paw and collar, but I want to enhance cat and suppress paw and collar. And so the hyperdirect pathway is going to suppress. And so for instance, it might suppress things that are not animals at all, because I might think banana. And I say, no, banana's not an animal, so I suppress banana. Then I think deer. Deer's an animal, so I want to enhance direct pathway, deer. And now if I'm asking you to say as many different animals in a minute as you can, now I want to, after I've said deer, I want to suppress deer in the future, because I don't want to say deer again, right? And so that might be the indirect pathway. Suppressing, enhancing, and suppressing. So I suppress banana to enhance deer, and then I suppress deer so I don't say it again. Does that make sense? It's a really simple explanation of what the basal ganglia may be doing for behavior. Picking and choosing among behaviors. Another real common task where this stuff is going to be involved would be the Stroop task again. So this is a kind of Stroop task variant. The standard Stroop task involves, first, you see colors, like you see red, blue, and green, and you say red, blue, and green for the colors. Then you see words, and you say red for the word red, and blue for the word blue, and green for the word green. And then in the third step, you see words printed in ink that's colored, but the ink doesn't match the words. And so the word green is printed in red ink. And you're supposed to say red, which is the color of the ink, and not green. The reason I bring that up is green is an automated response. Reading is a skill you're really, really good at. When you see a word, you read that word automatically, because most of the time, it's the word that matters and not the color of the word. The color of the word is a less automated response. You need to suppress the automated response, which is reading the word, which is what the hyperdirect pathway might do, in order to engage in reading the color, or naming the color, which is what the direct pathway might do. So again, suppressing and enhancing behaviors in order to pick ones that fit and don't fit. To these other examples, if you're playing a C major scale, you play C, D, and E, your next note is F. You want to enhance the F and suppress the G or the B, right? And so you want to play the scale in the correct order. So you're suppressing and enhancing behaviors depending on whether they fit or not. Finally, the cerebellum. So we talked about how the motor cortex, the premotor cortex and SMA, they're involved in planning multiple steps. The basal ganglia are involved in selecting among steps. The cerebellum is involved in stitching steps together, essentially. So it's a smoothing kind of a tool. And so it smooths postural and purposeful movements. It actually has an analogous role for cognitive and affective processes, but let's focus on the motor to give you an example of that. Organizationally, but briefly, the central structures of the cerebellum handle postural responsibilities. So the flocculonodular lobe and a vermis. These are more vestibular, proprioceptive, kinesthetic. Here we're more interested in the lateral hemispheres of the cerebellum. And the lateral hemispheres of the cerebellum contribute to independent limb movements. Again, the kind of stuff that the lateral corticospinal tract handles. And what they do, though, is not decide which movements to do or which order to do them in, but how to stitch them together to make them smooth. And I want to show you in a few different ways what I mean by that. Briefly along the way, I would also mention, I think I mentioned this before, there's a double crossing process where the pathways decusate twice in going to the cerebellum. And so cerebellar control is ipsilateral, not contralateral. And so the left hemisphere of the cortex handles the right body, but the left hemisphere of the cerebellum handles the left body. And so it is possible to have a cortical, I guess in principle, to have a cortical stroke that affects the left hemisphere of the brain and the left hemisphere of the cerebellum and has a mixed hemispheric effect, although that's going to be more subtle than the kind of mixed hemispheric effects you see in the brainstem. But let's not focus on that. Let's focus on the stitching together of behaviors. Here's that graphically. So the cerebellum isn't the thing that's initiating behavior. Like, it's not the primary motor area. It's modulating motor pathways. And so it has reciprocal connections with the cortex, with the thalamus, with other structures. And then it has reciprocal connections down into the spinal cord and the brainstem with vestibular nuclei, proprioceptive information, and so forth. Before I show you what this looks like. I want to kind of explain what I mean because this is a slightly confusing concept. What I mean by this stitching together. What I mean is kind of like, suppose that you were drawing a circle like this, right? So I drew a circle, but I only drew parts of it, right? Like I could be drawing this. This is not what I want, right? What I want is, hopefully I can draw what I want. Not very well, but now I'm looking more circular, right? So it's the stitching together. For instance, if I want to walk to the other side of the room, I know that my feet have to touch down in certain places, but the stitching together is the smoothing of the actions, as opposed to, like for instance, the way a toddler walks, where he takes one step, and then she thinks about what she wants to do, and she takes another step, and she takes another step. She's not moving in a fluid function, this toddler. I am. I'm moving with a coordination of movement so that it's smooth, and I don't have a jerkiness to my gait, right? Similarly, if I move my hand, I can move my hand like a robot, like in 80s dancing, or I can move my hand smoothly. That stitching together of the motion is what the cerebellum is doing. So if in some kind of sense the motion pathway looks like this, you want it to look like this and not like this, right? That's what I mean when I say that the cerebellum stitches motor patterns together. It takes the pieces and it joins them into a smooth process, which is important because those pieces will have different smoothing if they're in a different context. It's sort of like when you write cursive, your A, maybe for instance, the way the next part of the A looks, the last part of the A looks depends on what letter comes next, right? Because the cursive is connected together. So if you think about cursive, where the way you draw each letter depends on what letter comes before and after it, as opposed to the way you draw a block print, where it doesn't matter, that's a kind of transformation that the cerebellum does in a very broad sense, both for your thinking and for your body motions. So there are two cerebellar movement symptoms that are common that I want to mention. They are not only caused by the cerebellum, but the cerebellum is important in these, and they're ataxia and dysmetria. Ataxia means jerky motions. So again, like the 80s robot, jerky motions as opposed to smooth motions. Dysmetria means overshoot or undershoot. And I'm going to show you a video of these. Hopefully this works. Let's see here. Just do. I appear to have destroyed the computer. Let's see what we can do here. That's promising. My apologies. I don't know what's going on right now. I don't know if this thing has a reset button. Maybe it's a reset. Oh, there we go. Okay, good. Give it a second to warm back up. So this is, hopefully this works, is a YouTube video. Screen. I may need to turn off the lights to make this more visible. So this. Does that work? Can you see it? Okay. This gentleman is going to do something called is going to do a variety of coordinated hand movements. Let me mention briefly that a real common neurological test of this in a clinic for the hands is called the finger to nose to finger test. You may have heard of or seen that. What the clinician does is they have you sit, typically, and look straight at them so you keep your nose pointing towards their nose. And what they do is, so you put your finger on the tip of your nose, your index finger, and then they put their finger out in space and you touch their finger. And then they move their finger, you touch their finger, you go back and forth between their finger and your nose. And it's not quite the same thing as I'm doing it myself, but you're going to see these two symptoms. So in this finger to nose to finger testing, ataxia means my hand has a jerky pathway that's not direct from finger to nose. Dysmetria means I'm missing the finger, or I'm missing the nose, poking myself in the eye. So ataxia and dysmetria are the two symptoms. Let's see if we can see some of that in this gentleman. What you'll be looking for here is, notice what he does with his right hand, and then notice what he does with his left hand. So he's doing coordinated motions with his right hand. So he's kind of simulating the finger to nose to finger without another finger. Look at how much more difficulty he has doing the same thing with his left hand. He's dysmetric, he's missing his nose. He's missing that point that he's trying to touch. Notice the ataxic pattern, so the hand is not coming back to the nose in a direct route. So this hand is the symptomatic hand, and this hand is the normal hand. So just to reinforce a point, which hemisphere of the cerebellum would be involved in this case? Remember the cerebellum is ipsilateral, meaning unlike the cortex, the cerebellum handles the same side of the body. So that was his left hand. So which cerebellar cortex would be involved? Which cerebellar hemisphere would be involved? Left. Good. So, here we go. So that was ataxia and dysmetria. Again, ataxia is the jerkiness of the motion. Dysmetria is the over or undershoot. You can have ataxia for your hands. You can also have body ataxia, like a drunken gait, where you're stumbling around and you're not walking directly. So that's an ataxic gait. And things you get a dysmetric gait also, where you're not putting your feet in the right place. But these are particularly common as cerebellar symptoms. And particularly, as in that case, they're lateralizing. So they tell you something about where in the body this is happening, where in the brain this is happening. So finally, I want to briefly mention that the brainstem reticular formation not only controls the gamma motor neuron system to preserve muscle tone, but also controls some automatic and semi-automatic motor processes. These include things like sneezing, coughing, laughing, vomiting. These are all highly automated behaviors. It's hard to do them. A good example of how these are highly automated is it's really hard to fake them convincingly, right? Like if you want to laugh convincingly, you have to kind of make yourself think something is funny or something like that, because otherwise you give a laugh that's completely not convincing, right? Similarly, the coughs that you make for real are different from your fake coughs. Usually people can tell the difference pretty readily. If you want to produce a believable fake cough, you have to kind of like make yourself choke a little bit or something. These are all automated processes that come from the brainstem. I want to mention really briefly that an particularly interesting one is that some emotional behaviors, like laughter, are automated at the brainstem level. And there is a condition called pseudobulbar affect. And in pseudobulbar affect, essentially what happens is that you have triggering of these automated affective or emotional displays that is happening at the brainstem level. due to a certain kind of lesion that is caused by the brainstem and not caused by the underlying emotion. So people with pseudobulbar affect will suddenly start laughing or crying for no reason. It's usually actually aversive to them. It's kind of interesting, but in some of them, not always, but in some of them distraction or redirection is truly really helpful. So it might sound kind of cruel, but you have this stroke patient in your office and they're crying for no reason, and you actually ask them like, hey, what time is it? Which would normally be really cruel to ask somebody who's crying for an emotional reason. These people who are not crying because they're distressed, but are crying because the automated crying motor mechanism is being triggered. When you distract them and ask them to tell you what time it is, they'll stop crying. Because they're not actually sad, they're just having an unintentional triggering of an automated motor process. And that phenomenon is called pseudobulbar affect. There are actually some medical treatments for that, and sometimes it gets better. It can actually be really impairing and frustrating. I had a patient when I was at Mary Free Bed who had pseudobulbar affect. It really drove him crazy. He was a really high-functioning person, like a manager or executive, and it was really difficult for him to suddenly be laughing for no reason. Emotional control, was really important for the kind of work that he did. So I want to mention briefly that. But so the reticular formation also can trigger some really automated motor responses.